some people seem to have this irresistible urge to tear down and rebuild. There's a lot of money to be made. Hotels, office blocks, high-rise. The developers make a fortune, the laborers make a living. The workers, the ones who build the monuments, then tear them down again. All in a day's work. But for 5 years in the 1970s, the builders' labourers of New South Wales called a halt, took the centre stage, call it what you will, they made history. Like thousands of others, I got involved with this union. In one way or another, we were swept up in what became a powerful social movement, when the builders' labourers put the environment and people ahead of their own jobs. And it was all the more extraordinary because it sprang from the least expected of places. The 60s were the years of affluence, transition, and opportunity. Large foreign corporations, finance companies, insurance companies, and banks, many of them ripe with profits from the American war effort in Vietnam, were speculating and diversifying. Money flowed without regulation towards the promise of huge profits. Australia was tempting. Down under possessed a buoyant economy, high interest rates, an undervalued currency, and last but not least, extraordinarily amenable politicians. The Conservative Premier of New South Wales, Robert Askin, who was soon to become a multimillionaire, welcomed the powerful business interests that would reshape the central heart of Sydney forever.
I think as much as anything, looking back at those times, was the political and social climate here in Australia. You'll remember all this took place during the intervention in Vietnam, and the Australian people were demonstrating in a highly political way. And builders' labourers were looking at their TV screens and their newspapers and seeing people in their thousands committing acts of civil disobedience. They were trespassing, they were occupying, and they were standing up to the police and defying police. And not only were the authorities powerless to stop it, this massive action went on and on and on, and even those people, a lot of builders' labourers were involved, but even those who weren't could see this going on, and I believe the militancy and some of the actions employed by the builders' labourers during the 1970 strike came as a direct result of the collective experience, social and political experience of the Australian people.
Hello, my name's Jan Wood. Welcome to today's episode of Coffee Break. And today my special guest is Meredith, and our special topic is your latest book.
Absolutely. It's my book on ASIO. I decided to ask a number of well-known Australians to look at their ASIO files and then write about them. And it's quite interesting. You know, we have Anne Summers, Gary Foley, David Stratton, Philip Adams, Mark Aarons. On the back we have Michael Kirby, Frank Hardy, you know, Clive Everett, Wendy Bacon. It's Peter Cundall, the gardener. We have 27 chapters where people look at their ASIO files and we discover some really, really amazing things.
Okay, now Meredith, you're not allowed to, the ASIO can't release the ASIO files for how many years?
Well, originally it was 30 years, but it's now being changed to 20 years, but gradually. So I think it's every year we get another 2 years of files. So at the moment you can get up to 1986, and next year you'll be able to get up to 1988. So, and it's quite an easy process. You apply to National Archives and they will then inquire of it from ASIO, and maybe you end up with a wonderful diary of your life 30 years ago, and sometimes very good photographs too.
I can imagine it's quite a status to have an ASIO file these days.
Some of my friends have been mortified to discover they didn't have a file. I remember when Bob Carr shut down the Special Branch, which is New South Wales Special Branch, which is actually a sort of a state adjunct of ASIO. Everyone applied for their files, and Bob Carr actually applied for his file only to discover he didn't have one. So we wrote one for him, which was seen going to coffee shop, seen visiting mum, seen going to the library. If you're involved with scientific work, you may well have had an ASIO file if they were worried about your political background. Yeah.
Okay, now can I ask, what was the initial action, political action on your part that started your ASIO history?
Well, there's always something that triggers an ASIO file, and in my case it was my first arrest, which was a demonstration against John Gorton. It was in Martin Place, and it was about conscription and the Vietnam War, and I was arrested for obstructing the entrance to the men's toilet. We keep forgetting that there was a toilet right in the middle of Martin Place.
I remember that.
And we all sat down in front of it, and that's what we were charged with, obstructing.
And after you were charged, what happened? Did you go off in a paddy wagon?
Yes, we were taken off in a paddy wagon, and I met some people then who are still my very best, close friends. You always met nice people in paddy wagons. And I was arrested on a number of occasions, both over Vietnam, the anti-apartheid movement. At one stage with the anti-apartheid movement, I found it very difficult to even move about in the streets without being arrested. They were being very, very vicious at that stage. The women's movement, the early environment movement, Aboriginal land rights, a whole lot of issues I was involved with, and which I was arrested. But the other things that triggered a file was if you had a connection with the Communist Party or a Trotskyist group. They were very worried about the Trots. Maoist groups. If you had any connection at all with the East, what they call the Eastern Bloc.
Because a lot of young people today wouldn't understand how savage the Cold War was.
And how paranoid they were.
It was a psychological war,
well,
in a way.
I suppose you have to believe that they believed that communism was on our doorstep. Unfortunately, what I see from these 27 chapters is that the ASIO agents were unable to distinguish a threat to the state from a political view that was dissenting from the political views of the government of the day. So you have them acting as an arm of Sir Robert Menzies' very conservative government. I mean, particularly their interest in the anti-apartheid movement. I mean, in what way was Australians saying that apartheid was wrong in any way a threat to the state?
In Pat Fiskes' footage, Aboriginal rights and anti-racism and the war against apartheid was a very big part of that time. And that's another instance of you being arrested. What did you do?
Well, I was one of the leaders of the Stop the Tours campaign, and we were going to stop the football in order to stop the cricket, which was going to come later. And of course we were successful. We did stop the cricket tour. Sir Donald Bradman, as chair of the cricket board, did stop that tour, and to his credit. So I got 2 months jail for running onto the cricket ground and basically lying down in the middle of the scrum. It was we did stop the game, which was pretty fully clothed.
How old were you?
I was in my early 20s. I was a postgraduate student.
So, Meredith, when did you discover that you were a political activist?
Not straight away. I think I've always been an interventionist. I'm one of those people that can't see something happening and going wrong without trying to fix it. Even at I'm dreadful to be at other people's functions because I'm the one that always says, the microphone's not working, or, move them away from there because you can't see the screen, or, I'm the one I must be an awful person to have it at events. So I know I'm an interventionist, and I think I was probably halfway through first year university before I realised that I had to get involved in the anti-Vietnam activity. I just stopped being a Christian. I never joined the Communist Party, although obviously I was close to it. But Vietnam really changed my life because I realised that we were going out there killing people we had no right to kill, and of course young Australians were being killed too. So I didn't set out to be an activist, I just became one.
In the early 80s, Pat Fiskes made a documentary called Rocking the Foundations, and she's given me permission to use some of it. And some of the footage is very evocative of how volatile things were in the 70s and the early 80s. Like, the passions ran high. A lot of us were very idealistic.
These were the days of protest and what felt like real change. The campaign against Australian and American involvement in Vietnam was at its peak. The Aborigines were demanding justice, claiming their land rights. The anti-apartheid movement was growing. The all-white South African Springboks came to town to play football. The game was made a little more difficult by the huge daily demonstrations and obstructions. Not to mention members of the BLF who attempted to saw down the goalpost.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's time. The national leader of the Australian Labor Party, Mr. Gough Whitlam.
A new Prime Minister was elected. Gough Whitlam led a social democratic government into office after 23 years of unbroken conservative rule. Bold and immediate reforms began both at home and abroad. Authority, custom, traditional roles, all were in transition. Women's liberation was challenging male domination, prejudice, the exclusive right of men to work, even in the most macho of industries.
And I would say that the Jack Mundy's Green Bands period was one of the areas that that ASIO was concerned about because they saw it as being Communist Party activity, whereas really it was, yes, some of the people involved in it and some of the leadership of the Builders Labourers were in the Communist Party, but it was the beginning of urban environmentalism, and it was a very, very important thing, not just for Australia but for the world. It was the first time that unions had taken action on behalf of the environment.
Green bands were serious business and becoming known far and wide. The BLs were even called upon to stop work on a city office block because of a conservation issue in another state.
In this case, we responded to calls from conservationists thousands of miles away in North Queensland because a particular investor, one of the biggest investors in a proposed wood chip plant, has heavy investments in buildings in Sydney. And we told this particular developer that if he persisted with his intention of going ahead with this woodchip plant, there's every likelihood that this building in Sydney would not be completed. We were successful, and the particular investor said that he would not go ahead with his investment in the proposed woodchip plant. I think it is these sort of actions that are justified because conservationists in remote parts of Australia that have problems such as keeping this rainforest certainly need the assistance of those who have greater bargaining power as we have in the cities. And we've got to see that both country and city alike are all part of Australia and should be retained for all people.
Okay, now there's also the thing that after a certain period of time the ASIO files should be destroyed. But after reading your book, I thought these are such fabulous historic documents in the historical context, and these very passionate political activists. To me, it would be a terrible crime for these to be destroyed.
Yes, it was interesting. When the files were first opened up, there was a bit of a debate about the fact that this is terrible, they should just be destroyed, and how can these, abrogation of people's privacy be allowed to stand. But historians have found them incredibly useful. I've got friends who are using them at the moment to look at women's movements in the 40s and 50s. They're very useful documents. They're, you have to be careful because quite often they're very, very wrong. But there's a lot of useful information there. Some of the privacy issues have been addressed. You can now put in the file a sort of a rejoinder. Tom Uren has put in a rejoinder saying, I think that, that he actually wasn't in the Communist Party because they've obviously claimed he was. Uh-huh. And also, National Archives makes certain now that information that could be distressing is taken out of the files, because originally there was information in there about some of the targets self-harming or having an abortion or very personal information like that, and that has now been addressed, which I'm pleased about, because you can now look at other people's files on the National Archives website. So it's really important that, people said to me, was there anything in your file that you were upset about other people just being able to look at? And, there were a few pretty unkind things they said about me, but nothing that really worried me. But talking about Pat Fiskes' film, I think that one of the things I was really pleased about in this book was we managed to get Kevin Cook, who was an Aboriginal activist and organiser for the New South Wales Builders Labourers. He was a very important person in that early environment movement, and we've got Kevin Cook's chapter there, which is terribly funny because Kevin keeps saying, they don't seem to be interested in what we did. They keep reporting on all these meetings that we went to, but they never say how good the demo was at the end.
We were so successful in winning the big majority of disputes because of the financial assistance that workers received from their mates all around the city.
Yeah, what surprised me was the way small jobs in the suburbs knew about disputes in the city. They knew that they'd be on strike one day, and they levied themselves, and the suburbs paid a lot of money into the inner city jobs where most of the disputes were fought. I think that's how we won our blues.
Working in the city, there was always a stink on. There was always a blue on somewhere, and inevitably, if it looked like being a prolonged struggle, well, the employer would refer it to the Arbitration Commission. There's some fairly hilarious scenes there. We always insisted, that the workers get along and play an active role in those court cases. So we would have the master builders all done up in their finery and the beak sitting up there, and the courtroom would be full of workers who were angry enough about having been forced into a strike situation off the job to be there and to voice their griefs.
When I started on it, I thought this was really going to be about ASIO and about people's files, but when I read the final version, I realised this is actually a social history of the 60s and 70s, and really one that hasn't been talked about much.
I know, it's interesting. recording of history. People tend to think that history happened 100 years ago, but it's actually happening all the time. But you need a little bit of hindsight on it to get the perspective on it.
It made me realise, though, that a lot of this material, we need to write more about the origins of the women's movement.
Yep.
Not much written about it. I want to write about women in unions in the 70s because I was very active in my union. I was president of the Academics Union, and of course got involved with Labour Council and the ACTU, and we were not really wanted at the time. We were women and white-collar workers, and that wasn't considered to be proper work, and it was a real challenge to get your voice heard as a woman unionist. So I want to write a bit about that too.
You were talking about the recording of history, and the women's movement hasn't properly been documented. Now, coming up next year, 2015, is the 100th anniversary of WILF, which is Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm proposing to make a documentary from the woman's perspective. They were anti-war. They were Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We are a global organisation. We are still fighting environmental issues and peace issues. Now, you've been a WILF woman since when?
Oh, look, I can't remember. I think I probably joined in the 70s sometime. I probably lapsed when I had a small child, you know, how everything...
Yeah.
But I've been certainly a member again for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So on and off for 40 years I've been a member of WILF.
I know. Meredith, it's a fabulous story. So in 1915, after Gallipoli, thousands of women from all over Europe converged on The Hague and pleaded, please stop this carnage. Please find peaceful ways. And they were right, weren't they, Meredith?
They were absolutely right. The more you look at the First World War, it was really a trade war, and it was absolute slaughter for no reason at all. Nothing was fixed.
Yes.
And then, of course, we get the Second World War later as a result of the First World War. I'm actually going to be in London for the beginning of this year for the period where the First World War starts, the 100th anniversary. And we're going into Trafalgar Square to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the wonderful speech made by Keir Hardie, where he stood in Trafalgar Square, the great anti-war speech, where the British socialists opposed the war. So it wasn't just women, but women really did see the craziness of sending their sons and husbands off to be killed.
I know.
You know, Australians going to Turkey to get killed.
Vietnam, save our sons.
Exactly.